You are listening to the Intrepid radio program with Scotty Roberts. Intelligent Talk.
You ready for this? Oh, say, can you see by the dawn's early light what so proudly we hail at the twilight's last gleaming, whose broad stripes and bright stars through the perilous night o'er the ramparts we watched were so gallantly streaming, and the rocket's red glare, the bombs bursting in air, gave proof through the night that our flag was still there. Oh, say, does that star-spangled banner yet wave o'er the land of the free and the home of the brave? There. That's the new opening for the show. Well, for today anyway. Take that, all my Australian and British and European friends who are listening. You know, the reason that came to mind, I just felt like singing that. I was singing that this morning while I was shaving. And so I got a couple of nicks in there while I was doing that, especially on the high notes. But something that occurred to me, and the reason I wanted to do that, was for all the talk I hear of in America, from Americans, how much that song should be abolished, how much we should abolish the Pledge of Allegiance to the flag, how much we should not hold that flag right there in any kind of high ideal. And it's not about a piece of fabric, folks. It's about a symbol for what it stood for. And that is, I don't believe in laws saying you can't desecrate the flag. If somebody is so stupid to live under the system that we have of freedom, liberty, constitutional rights, I don't care what abuses go on behind the scenes by politicians. If you want to do that, that's your right to do that. But you're going to have to stand up against people who stand for it. And I've always said, if you stand on it, you're not standing for it. And so that's a symbol in this nation. Now, maybe your other nations, you've got other things that you hold up as ideals and symbols of your ideals. In this country, it's that flag. And so I just felt full of nationalism this morning, full of patriotism, full of great historical vigor when it comes to the flag. So there you go. How's that for starting off the show today? And maybe if I had ever warmed up or done anything, we could do a better job. But welcome to my show. This is the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. And that's at odysy1.com. And you can come over and hear everything that is Odyssey Radio. There's a full lineup that you could listen to all day. Check out the other shows, as well as hearing this one on all their various internet networks and terrestrial stations. Also, this show is broadcasting in a simulcast over on my YouTube channel, and that's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. Come and join all the Intrepids and join the chat room, join in the conversation during this show, and I'd love to see you there, and you'll find out there's a huge family of listeners there already. Thanks for being here, every one of you. Now, today, although I didn't give a dissertation on the national anthem or the national flag and all of that, I just felt like singing that this morning. And maybe tomorrow it'll be something else I want to sing. But there you go. If you're an American, be proud of being an American. If you're an Australian, be proud of being an Australian. If you're a Brit, be proud of being part of the United Kingdom. Be proud of who you are, where you are, what your nation stands for. If it doesn't stand for tyranny, if it stands for freedom, if it stands for individual liberty, right there alongside you. All right, that's all I got on that. All right, let's move on. I got other things I want to talk about today. And I want to kind of pick up where we left off yesterday. Now, there was some concern that some of the things that we were talking about last night and over a couple of days, that's just New Ageism. It's really not. I think New Ageism kind of builds out of some of this stuff, but this is the stuff that is the stuff that is the stuff, that's like double stuffed Oreos, of Gnosticism. The Oreo of Gnosticism, double stuffed. And so you're seeing some of the basics translated into more probably modern language. And we're going to go on with that. Remember, we talked about, and I read a book called The Laughing Jesus. It was by Timothy Freak and Peter Gandy. They're the same ones who wrote The Jesus Mysteries and Jesus and the Lost Goddess. These are good books to get into and dig into. You don't have to accept everything they say, just like anything else you read, but it adds. It's like putting another apple on the cart. And so it's good. But they had a book entitled The Laughing Jesus. And that's what I want to call this one. And I'm pulling a lot of material from their book on this one. So I want you to, and by the way, you're going to keep hearing that in the background. I've got a computer over there that wants to keep restarting. That's my old one that was dying on me. And while it's right now, it's actually booting up once again. I may reach over there and just shut it down for a while. It's still in on mode, but it over and over and over again starts up and ends. So you're gonna get a little bit of that sound going on in the background. Yeah, there. See, it didn't even boot up all the way. So, and I close it and it still does it. So I've been experimenting. So sorry about that noise in the background, the ambient noise. Today it's not my children. Today it's my old computer. So the Laughing Jesus. Hafiz Sufi Gnostic said this: I understand your wounds that have not healed. They exist because God and love have yet to become real enough to allow you to forgive the dream. Let's take a look at that. Let's think about that for a second. If you can stand back far enough from your cultural conditioning, the literalist Christian message can sometimes look kind of absurd and even grotesque. You were born in sin, it says, and you deserve to be punished. And the theology behind that was because Adam sinned and was the first man, Adam bequeathed to the rest of mankind a sin nature, which smacks of mythology, but that's the theology. And it was the second man, the coming of the Messiah, that was to be the one to eradicate that or offer a way out of that sin nature. So you're born in sin. You deserve to be punished for your sin. Not because God is all love, but because God is all holy, and his holiness cannot withstand the sin. That's the way the theology says. So God sent his own son, Jesus, to the planet Earth to suffer horribly on the cross, to pay for yours and my sins. And Jesus died for you, and then he resurrected, and he went to heaven. And if you believe this really happened, that this is a literal history of what Jesus did, you're going to also go to heaven when you die, where you'll have a very nice time forever. But if you don't believe that the resurrection really happened, when you die, you'll go to hell, this eternal, infinite place of separation from the love of God and a place of torment, as we are told through theology. And you'll be subjected to very horrible tortures for all of time, for all of outside of time, eternity, by a God of love, by the way, is the one that does this. And this God of love, the way we used to explain it when I was in seminary, the way I learned it, was that yes, God is all loving, but he is also all holiness, and his holiness precedes his love. And the holiness demands retribution payment for the sin nature. And if you don't accept it in Christ, then you're going to have to be condemned for all of eternity, from here till infinite forever. And I used to say, the way I looked at this, and I may have voiced this before, was I started to find it very difficult to believe that God has said there's one of two places you end up after you die. One of them is a place of paradise, enjoying Him, and the other is a place of torment and torture, separate from Him. And so, therefore, God laid out or prescribed a plan that you can accept, so you can not suffer for all eternity. And He wrote that down, inspired men to write this down 2,000 years ago. And He sent His Son 2,000 years ago. And He has left an infinite, non-ending, eternal decision up to the minds of human beings who are finite creatures in the here and the now, in the physical realm. We're finite. Do we even grasp infinity? Because we have to place it in a landscape of linear time to understand infinity, endlessness. And so I thought, would a God of love, would a God of holiness condemn His creation, who chose to exercise the free will He gave them, according to theology, to reject that message because there's nothing about it that seems literal and new? It seems like an old message 2,000 years ago based on a culture that believed this is the way things were. And so I had those questions. And surely for any compassionate person, the existence of a hell must make the enjoyment of heaven impossible. How could anyone with an ounce of kindness and love in their heart enjoy heaven knowing that others were languishing in hell at that same time? Simply for not believing in a historical event for which there's no solid evidence other than faith alone. Putting your faith in something infinite from the standpoint of a finite mind. It seems somewhat harsh. If there really is a God running this post-mortem apartheid, then you'd almost look at Him to be a monster. And we need to indict Him for crimes against humanity. Now, that might seem extreme if you're in Western Christianity. But think about that for a minute. Let's say you have friends that you love, family that you love, and you are the one who believes in Jesus, has put your faith in Him. You become the born-again Christian, and you go to heaven when you die, and you enjoy the paradise and rewards of heaven. Excuse me, my coffee is speaking. Could you enjoy that if you knew that loved ones you had that didn't accept that message were languishing in hell for all eternity? Would that be heaven? I heard one evangelist back in my seminary days that put it this way. He said, when it says in the Bible that God will wipe all the tears from our eyes when we enter heaven, he suggested that God is wiping our memory of all those we know who are going to go to hell for all eternity, and that those were the tears being wiped away. And I have to ask if you believe that that's true, if you believe that that's the way God works. Now, I'm going to tell you that the grim literalist version of the Christian message has nothing to do with the teachings of the original Gnostic Christianity. Pardon me, I got to take a sip of my coffee. And pardon the cough, too. No cough button. They didn't teach that believing in the historical death and resurrection of Jesus would save us from hell when we die. That would be impossible. The Gnostics didn't teach that, because according to the Gnostics, we're already dead and already living in hell now, in the here and now, in the moment. That was their philosophy. That was their interpretation of a hell. And we are the dead, and we don't know it. It's a spooky thought, which sounds as though it's come straight out of, I don't know, something like The Sixth Sense. I see dead people. If you do paranormal investigation like I do with Rocky and my wife, you run across these spirits. These are people that have gone on. Is that who we're connecting to? Or Christian theology teaches us that's just all demons impersonating as humans that have moved on. But look around you. You're going to see what the Gnostics mean. Most of us wander around like semi-conscious shades. We're tormented by endless fears and anxieties, both here in the present, in the life we live, and also of the afterlife. And there's a lot of people I know who are Christians who you say, are you going to go to heaven when you die? Well, I sure hope so, is the answer. That's my hope. Remember, hope is for the hopeless. So listen to all of us who moan about our worries and our woes, like weary banshees looking for rest. Look into the dull and fretful eyes of someone on their way to work in the morning rush hour, and you'll see the face of the living dead. I saw it this morning. I had the guy coming out at 7 a.m. this morning plowing out my driveway from the snow. And he didn't look like he was loving his job. It's just what he did. And he said, I'll be back if they plow you in again from the street. And then he ended that by saying, the company's going to have to pay me extra to come back and do that. So I don't care about coming out at 7 a.m. Only if, they got to accept that I'm going to have to come back later and plow everybody out again after the big snowplows come through on the street. So this is what people go to work like in the mornings. And for the Gnostic, heaven and hell aren't places we go to when the body dies. Those are two ways of experiencing what we were talking about as the life dream. When we're identified with our separate life, our life persona, and we are dead to our essential nature, and life becomes a nightmare of fear and suffering, we have fallen asleep in hell. As Plotinus puts it, we need to wake up from heavy sleep and take off the garments of hell. And as the secret book of John, one of the Gnostic writings, says, heaven and hell are here and now, whilst we're identified with the separate self, the dream life dream inevitably becomes a nightmare. But the moment we wake up to oneness, hell is transformed into heaven. Heaven is the experience of what we were talking about last night, big love. That sounds very new agey. Oh, I gotta love everybody, kumbaya. It's not. It's talking about that. All we were talking about last night with big love was that being able to recognize your awareness. And when you have awareness, you have a greater love for yourself and for everybody and everything around you, because you are a part of everything. That's what Gnosis tells you, teaches you, gives to you. It's not somewhere we go when we die, hell or heaven. It's a state of loving life which arises when we wake up and we live lucidly. Life is a joy to those who've rediscovered who they really are by waking up. Lucid living, just like lucid dreaming. I am aware that I am experiencing this. I'm awareness. Life is a joy when you have that, because you have rediscovered who you really are when you wake up. The gospel of truth teaches that, and one of the Gnostic gospels. But whilst we're engrossed in the dramas of the life dream, we can't see how wonderful life really is. But when we wake up and we live lucidly, we find that we're already in heaven, if you will. In the Gospel of Thomas, Jesus is asked by his disciples, when will heaven come? And he replies, it won't come by waiting for it, because heaven is spread out upon the earth but people don't see it. Why would that gospel be disregarded when the other gospels, the four that appear in Scripture, were chosen by the bishops of the Orthodox Roman Catholic Literalist Church as the only four that were God-breathed? Why were the other ones thrown out? This gospel is as valid as Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Especially when you realize that Matthew and Luke were based on Mark, which was based initially on Gnostic teachings. But it got edited. Let's leave it at that. We already covered that stuff. Jesus said it won't come by waiting for it, heaven. Because heaven is spread out upon the earth before you, but people just don't see it. And so what do we have to do? What do we have to do with ourselves? We have to wake the dead. The essential message of Christianity is that while we identify the separate self, we are dead and we need to come to life or resurrect, just as Jesus did. In the Greek used by the original Christians, the word usually translated resurrect also means awaken. The resurrection represents waking up and experiencing gnosis. The resurrection isn't something that just happened in the past to Jesus. That's just the story that has become the literalist history of the Orthodox Church. Neither is it something which may happen to you after you die. That's just a fantasy. The resurrection is something you must experience for yourself in this present moment, in the now, in the here and the now. Experiencing awake now is resurrection. That's your essential nature as awareness. A Christian text called the Treatise on the Resurrection, which could equally be called the Treatise on Awakening by the Greek language used, announces this: the world is an illusion. The resurrection, awakening, is the revelation of reality. Reality, what really is. Now, this text teaches that when Jesus resurrected, he swallowed up the invisible, or the visible by means of the invisible, and he showed us the way to our immortality. And I'm almost out of time in this segment, believe it or not. To resurrect is to become conscious of being the emptiness of invisible awareness, which contains the world and everything we understand, and which exists unborn and undying beyond the limits of linear time. This is why the Gnostics teach that Christianity is about being saved by resurrecting to eternal life. The Greek word, which is usually translated saved, means to be preserved or become permanent. Gnosis is being saved, becoming permanent, because it's the discovery that our essential nature is the eternal presence of awareness. You get that? That eternal, preserved understanding that we are aware. And on that note, I got to cut out for break. Folks, 2 minutes. We'll be right back. Hang tight. right, folks, welcome back from that break. No singing this time around. Thanks for sitting it out. This is Scotty Roberts. You're listening to the Intrepid radio program right here on the Odyssey Radio Network. Go over to odysy1.com to hear just the audio, the radio version of this show, and find out all the outlets and all the terrestrial stations where you can catch it. Or come on over to my simulcast of this broadcast over on my YouTube channel. That's youtube.com/Mr. Scotty Roberts. One of the big advantages of listening to the show and watching it over on the video is you get to join the YouTube channel, the chat stream. There you go. Not channel, chat stream. In the channel. The chat stream in the channel. With all the live commentary on the show and conversation that goes on. So we'll see you there if you're not there. And we left off talking about how gnosis is being saved or preserved because it's the discovery that our essential nature is the eternal presence of being aware and awake. Now, according to Tertullian, the Gnostics teach that those without gnosis are the dead. And resurrecting is awakening to gnosis. It's the discovery of what Paul the Apostle calls the Christ, who represents our shared essential nature as the oneness of awareness. As a Gnostic teacher, he sees his job as working until the Christ arises in you. And Paul urged her, he even said, "Wake up, sleeper! Rise from the dead. Let the Christ enlighten you." This is the authentic message of Christianity. While we're unconsciously identified with our separate persona in the life dream, we are the dead Christ, lost in the nightmare of separateness, suffering in hell. But when we awaken to our shared essential nature as the Christ, the resurrected Christ, the aware Christ, the awakened Christ, we resurrect from the dead and we partake in eternal life. Now, resurrecting from the dead transforms the life dream from the hell of separation to the heaven of big love. Too new agey for you? The heaven of awareness that we all are one, that we're all connected, that we're all universe. All right? Some of that has that feel of New Ageism because New Ageism has latched onto this stuff and teaches the same kind of thing. But this is what is at the core of Gnosticism, the mysteries, the Gnostic mysteries. So in Christian mythology, Jesus is portrayed as resurrecting in the body because big love is a feeling we experience in the body. It's literalist. Resurrecting from the dead is coming to life as a person. To resurrect is to become enlivened. It's loving being in the world, though knowing our essential nature is not of the world. The Apostle Paul said this, "When anyone is united with the Christ, there is a new world. The old disappears and a new order begins." Now, the Apostle Paul, I've done a lot of talking about the Apostle Paul. I've got friends of mine that talk about it. I've got my friend Jeff Dougherty, who's written a book about it, Apostle Paul Antichrist. And I think that Paul did hijack Christianity, but at the same time, it isn't that everything he said was valueless. It's that he taught a different form of Christianity. So that's why I quote Paul from time to time. Now let's look at this idea of suffering. In some versions of the Gnostic Jesus myth, it's not the real Jesus who is crucified, but only his eidolon, or his image. The real Jesus is represented as laughing, whilst his apparent nature suffers. The wonderful figure of the laughing Jesus is the Western equivalent of the laughing Buddha. Both represent the discovery of joy, the transcendence of suffering through ceasing to identify with the separate self. But what's so powerful about the symbol of the laughing Jesus is that Jesus isn't represented as just transcending suffering. His apparent nature is also suffering terribly on the cross. The laughing Jesus symbolizes the state of lucid living in which we're able to love life even when we're suffering. That's hard to comprehend. When you go through something like a Roman crucifixion, one of the most cruelest, torturous ways to die in the ancient world, and yet we say that Jesus laughed through that because of his connection with awareness. Remember, he did say from the cross, "Forgive them, for they know not what they do." Suffering is unavoidable because life is predicated on suffering. Every life form exists by killing and consuming other life forms. Life is possible only because the cosmos is continually consuming itself. To be a person in the life dream is inevitably to suffer. As separate individuals, we're insignificant specks in a huge and hostile universe. Each one of us is just another vulnerable body amongst billions of bodies waiting to die. No wonder we so often feel fearful, insecure, and alone. I think of Dr. Richard Feynman, who I've quoted many times, astrophysicist, contemporary of Einstein and Oppenheimer. A lot of his lectures are still available from the 50s and the 60s. You can hear them recorded. I loved the way he thought. And he used to say about Christ, he would say, "The earth." Okay, I like doing it in his New York kind of Jewish New York thing. He'd say New York. He'd say the earth. He came to the earth. He says, one of the manifestations of God in this one of these stories came to earth. And he said, I find that too provincial, too local, too colloquial to be able to identify with it. And that's what it is when we say we're all these individual bodies that are floating out there, and there's billions of us in the middle of nothingness of the universe. And in the universe, this place was the place where the creator of the universe made the only people who exist and sent his only begotten Son to save those only people he created from eternal damnation. That's the way that looks. And once again, just as an aside, if we're the only ones here in the universe, it's an awful waste of space. But if God did it that way, what was he trying to tell us? Pardon my coughing today. I am coming down with a little bit of a cold, but trying to combat it. And I cough all the time. I've been coughing since I was 18. So who the hell knows what's going on in there? So suffering is by definition undesirable. To like suffering would be impossible. It'd be perverse. But to embrace suffering with loving acceptance is an inevitable part of the dream of awakening, and it's perfectly possible. Suffering in this life, folks, is unavoidable. Every one of you out there could attest to that. But just suffering for the sake of suffering, can be avoided. Lucid living is the paradoxical state of appearing to be a person in the life dream who sometimes suffers, yet knowing ourselves to be awareness exists beyond all polarities, including joy and suffering. Lucid living doesn't mean we never suffer, because we still have an apparent nature, which sometimes experiences physical pain, psychological anguish, maybe many times. Maybe there are some of you out there right now that are stuck in suffering. stuck in anguish, stuck in anxieties, sometimes because of the things that are happening around us and affecting us. But when we experience lucid living, we don't only experience all of those things, we're conscious of both our essential nature and our apparent nature. We can suffer as a person when life is tough, while also embracing our suffering with unconditional acceptance. Awareness, loving awareness, if you will. As Jesus teaches in the Acts of John, another Gnostic writing, we can learn to suffer and not to suffer. Waking up is an experience of being aware, of experience the big love, if you will. A love so big that it mitigates the horrors of life. From the it perspective of our apparent nature within the life dream, suffering, illness, death can truly be terrible experiences, but the experience of being awake and big love and awareness, being awareness, is the thing that enables us to embrace both the happiness and the heartbreak of life. It doesn't diminish the anguish of grief. It doesn't diminish tragedy that happens to us, that we experience. But it adds to these experiences a bittersweet poignancy, a matter, a thing that matters. The experience of being aware of this big love we talked about last night assuages our suffering and enables us to bear the unbearable because we've become aware in the moment. Remember a few days ago, that whole practice I said, try this. Envision yourself being in the now, being apart from it, being aware of it, being awake from it. When you do that, those are the things that help you face the unbearable. It's not that you won't have grief. It's not that you won't experience tragedy. It's not that you won't experience illness or suffering and death. It's that the way we see those things are deeply transformed when we separate ourselves from the life dream experience and put ourselves into the awareness, the awakening. So when we're lost in the illusion of separateness, we see our experiences either good or bad. Lucid living is adopting a both-and perspective. A both-and, both/and perspective. It's recognizing that every experience is both good and evil. Good and bad. It's like the example I used, and I'm sorry, it waxes a little political, but I look at Adam Schiff and the impeachment stuff. I think he is a stupid man. I think he is an outright liar. I think he is lying to advance a political agenda. But at the same time, I experience that bad of him. I also look and say there's got to be a good of him as well. He may believe so deeply in what he's doing that he justifies the lie. I don't excuse that. I'm just saying. He also, like I've said before, is probably somebody who loves his family dearly. So while you have a man that's doing bad, there's also a man who is doing good. And you have to look at him that way. I will tangibly disagree with him and fight against that things that I see as bad, but that doesn't mean I will not accept him as being innately a good person who does bad things, makes bad choices. My own 19-year-old son is a wonderful, loving, caring individual who makes bad choices sometimes, and he's had to pay for it. And I've had to stand on his side while at the same time telling him you got to face the music on some of these things. And we're talking about, teenage indiscretions. The kind of stuff you could go to juvie hall for, which he never did. And he's just starting to learn that now as an adult, he can't do those same things anymore. He's only going to get a free out of jail card so often. This loving, wonderful, beautiful boy that I have, who has such great potential, yet makes bad choices because he doesn't think things through. There's a duality there. So, and even at the worst experience, the worst experience can act as a catalyst for our awakening. That's what I tell my son. The things you experience, you haven't seen the worst, and you don't want to see the worst, but you're seeing a glimmer of the worst. And that is a teaching experience. That's something that will be the catalyst to bring you to being awake. And so even that is something that is good for us. The suffering, the hardships, the bad times, because they are stepping stones to getting to a better place. Indeed, as those who have suffered much often will tell you, it's sometimes the most difficult of experiences which most powerfully wake us up from the numbness that we call normality. Do you want to be normal? Or do you want to step up above normal and be aware? Everything in the life dream exists in polarity, and it's both good and bad. There's nothing so good that it doesn't have a bad side, and nothing so bad that it doesn't have something good in it. Science has given us the ability to almost eliminate some horrendous diseases, but it's also given us Hiroshima, Nagasaki. World War II entailed untold cruelty, yet it led to peace in Europe. The Holocaust was designed to exterminate the Jewish race, but it inadvertently led to the establishment of a Jewish homeland in Israel for the first time in 2,000 years. Whether you agree with all the politics behind it, the Balfour proclamations, all the workings of the Zionists in the century before the Holocaust, what ended up happening as the Holocaust was the establishment of a Jewish state in an ancient homeland by many people who were Jewish only by religion, not by race. They weren't Semitic peoples necessarily. Most of them, a lot of them were Hungarians, Germans, Polish, and so on. Maybe they could trace their roots back. But European Jewry became Israel. And perhaps they have their roots all the way back. And don't get me wrong. Don't go, oh, Scotty, you're skirting on anti-Semitism. No, I'm not. If you think that, then I'm not explaining myself very well. Hopefully you get that. I read a very good book a long time ago, Exodus by Leon Uris. They made it a movie. Paul Newman was in the movie in I think it was the late 50s. And it was about the reestablishment of the State of Israel. Excellent movie. And maybe read that as a novel to get an understanding of what happened at the reestablishment of the State of Israel. It's a great fictional way to look at a non-fictional event. So anyway, I'm going to move on from that. This present moment is both full of joy and suffering. And right now, somewhere, a mom is cuddling her beautiful newborn baby. Two young lovers are telling each other of their feelings for the first time. Someone's reaching out to comfort a stranger in distress, but also in this present moment, a mother is watching her baby starve to death. Two young lovers have discovered the heartbreak of betrayal. Someone's walking past a stranger crying out for comfort with detached indifference. These things are all happening all at the same time. Just by way of illustration, I'm using those three things. Lucid living is embracing all of this with big love. Sorry to keep repeating that, but that's what it is. Big awareness, which takes great courage. Loving isn't just a good feeling. It also entails suffering willfully. When we love each other, when we love others, we share in their anguish as well as their joy. It was interesting. I was listening to the Joe Rogan's radio show yesterday, and he had Bill Maher on. Bill Maher, famous liberal, has his talk show. I don't even know what it's called. Politically Incorrect? Is that still the title of his show? Well, they were talking about love for a minute there. And he said, love to me, he says, is that willingness to allow yourself to, how did he put it? I don't think he used the words to be hurt, but allowing yourself to be hurt for the betterment of the other person. And he meant that in a more emotional way. He said, if that other person in your relationship needs to be out of that relationship to be happy, he says, then your position as someone who actually loves that person, you put that person's needs before your own. That's what he was getting at. That just popped into my head. I just saw that yesterday afternoon. So, loving isn't just a good feeling. It also entails that willful suffering. It's that giving of yourself to someone. It's the suffering inherent in big love, which stops many of us from waking up. We feel it's simply too painful to wake up in love. So we choose to be numb and we withdraw. But it's only too difficult whilst we remain identified with the separate self. It is too much to expect an isolated individual to open their heart to all the suffering of the world. But the more we awaken to oneness, the more big love becomes not only possible but natural. And now I'm just looking to the emotion of the world. When I say big love and I'm mentioning these examples, you got to pull back from that a little bit and look at being awake and aware of everything that's going on around you. This is the state of gnosis, symbolized by the sublime figure of a laughing Jesus, one that could look at his suffering and still laugh, because he understood the greater impact and the greater meaning. So, death is safe. Jesus laughs in the face of death. He would prefer that, remember when he prayed in the garden? I ask that this cup be taken from me. Nevertheless, not my will but yours, he said to God. He preferred that the cup of death pass him by. He didn't want to suffer. But in accordance with the story, he knew what was coming, and he accepted it. But when he realizes that he's destined to die, he accepts it unconditionally. Jesus is able to embrace death because he's already metaphorically died by ceasing to identify with his apparent nature. The Gnostic secret of being able to face death is simple. Don't wait. Die now. Plato describes the true philosopher as someone who makes dying his way of life. Paul wrote, I die daily. Valentinus teaches we choose to die so that we can annihilate death completely. The Islamic Gnostic Abd al-Qadir explains, there are two types of death, one which is inevitable and common to all, and one which is voluntary and experienced by few. Broad is the path that leads to destruction, narrow is the way that leads to life, Jesus said. It's the second death, which even Muhammad prescribed, saying, die before you die. I don't care what his followers have made what he started with, and I don't think he was a good person by nature, but there were good things about him that came out of him. Die before you die. That's a great universal principle. Those who die this voluntary death are resurrected. Now, when we identify exclusively with our physical body, we're consciously or unconsciously in a constant state of anxiety, because decay is death. And death is what inevitably lies ahead for this walking, talking skin bag that we live in. And by the way, I'm not saying when quoting even Muhammad, there are things that they do now in their vile terroristic branches of Islam where they're constantly convincing themselves that to die is a good thing because they will receive rewards in heaven. That's not what it means to die before you die. It means to understand your position. What lies ahead for the skin bags of us, of who we are, of what we are, physically. When we wake up, we realize we don't need to fear death at all. Not death of the body, any more than we need to fear dying in a dream. The more lucid we become, the less we fear death, which makes living a lot more enjoyable. When we awaken to the way things actually are, we realize that death is safe. Fearing and resisting death is like a young child fearing and resisting sleep, like mine do almost every night, because it doesn't understand that renewal comes only through disillusion. Worrying about the death of our apparent nature is like worrying about what will happen to our reflection when we stop looking in the mirror. The Gnostic pagan, I can't ever pronounce his name, Epictetus, it's because it's the uncommon mixture of consonants. Epictetus teaches this. He says it's your fear of death that terrifies you. You can think about a thing in many ways. You can scrutinize your idea of death. But is it true? Is it helpful? Don't fear death. Rather, fear your fear of death. Paraphrased by Winston Churchill, not Winston Churchill. I was thinking of something else he said, but by FDR. During World War II, we have nothing to fear but fear itself. Death seems terrifying to the degree that we're identified with our mortal nature. Most of us fear death because we're extremely attached to our present persona in the life dream, and we don't want it to end. But death is the discovery that we are really not attached to our present life persona, any more than to a persona in a dream at night. We feel attached while we're dreaming, but not when we wake up. In the same way that we don't mourn the passing of a dream when we rise in the morning, when we die, we'll not mourn the passing of a person we appear to be in the life dream right now. And you know what else has to come to death? This show. For the moment, I'm at the end of my time. Hopefully not overtime. We're going to pick up on this stuff tomorrow. 23-hour breaks, folks. 23-hour break, and we'll be back. Think about where you are in all of this stuff. Be awake. Talk to you later.